An African girl sold for $1 million to a mysterious Arab executive in an underground auction that was never supposed to happen. What seemed like the darkest moment of her life becomes the beginning of an extraordinary journey that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, identity, and the power of hidden truths. The shocking revelation that unfolds will leave you questioning the very nature of fate itself. This is a story of courage, deception, and a twist so unexpected that it will change how you see the world forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The underground auction house lay hidden beneath the glittering facade of Marrakech's most exclusive hotel, unlike the tourist markets above, where merchants hawked colorful fabrics and spices. This basement held a different kind of commerce, one that dealt in lives rather than goods. The room reeked of expensive cologne mixed with the acrid smell of fear, a combination that had become all too familiar to those who frequented such gatherings. Carved stone arches supported the ancient ceiling, their Moorish designs now witnessing horrors their original creators never could have imagined. Persian rugs covered the cold floor, their intricate patterns absorbing the whispered conversations of men who preferred shadows to sunlight. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the faces of the attendees, each light fragment reflecting the fractured morality of those gathered below. In this suffocating atmosphere sat Rashid al-Zahrani, a figure whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. His steel-gray hair was perfectly styled, contrasting sharply with the deep lines etched around his dark eyes, lines that spoke of decades spent making impossible decisions. In the world of international finance, tonight, however, he wasn't here for business, at least not the kind that appeared on any corporate ledger. Rashid adjusted the platinum cufflinks on his midnight blue suit, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years when facing situations that made even his iron composure waver. The invitation had arrived at his private residence 3 weeks ago, delivered by a courier who disappeared into the Casablanca night before Rashid could ask any questions. The message was simple: your presence is requested for a matter concerning your family's honor. The Crescent Moon Hotel, Marrakech, basement level, midnight. The mention of family honor had been enough to draw him here. Despite every instinct screaming that this was a trap, the al-Zahrani name carried weight across North Africa and the Middle East, built over generations of careful business dealings and strategic alliances. But with that prominence came enemies, and Rashid had learned long ago that threats could come wrapped in the most elegant packages. The auctioneer, a thin man with gold teeth and nervous eyes, stepped forward as the room's murmur died to an expectant hush. "Esteemed guests," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who had conducted too many such events. "Tonight we present opportunities that extend far beyond mere acquisition. Each offering tonight represents possibilities." Rashid's jaw tightened. He'd attended enough legitimate auctions in his business career to recognize the coded language being used here. This wasn't about art or artifacts, this was about human trafficking, disguised beneath layers of euphemism and expensive wine. His hand instinctively moved toward his phone, but he stopped himself. Whatever had brought him here, whatever connection this had to his family, he needed to see it through. The first lot was brought forward a young man, perhaps 20, his eyes darting frantically round the room as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. The bidding was swift and brutal. Numbers called out with the same casual indifference used to bid on furniture. Rashid felt his stomach turn, but he remained seated, waiting for whatever revelation had drawn him to this hellish gathering. Then she appeared. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, her dark skin luminous despite the harsh fluorescent lighting that had been installed to better display the merchandise. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to glow against her complexion, and her hair was arranged in intricate braids that spoke of careful preparation, as if someone had wanted her to look her absolute best for this moment. But it was her eyes that made Rashid's breath catch in his throat. They weren't filled with the terror he'd seen in the previous victims. Instead, they burned with a defiant intelligence that seemed to challenge every person in that room. She looked directly at the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the assembled buyers with what could only be described as disdain. "This," the auctioneer announced with obvious pride, "is Kessie, 19 years old, from a small village outside Accra, educated, resilient, and," he paused for effect, "carrying knowledge that makes her particularly valuable to the right buyer." Knowledge, the word hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Rashid leaned forward slightly, his business instincts sharpening. This wasn't just human trafficking, there was something else at play here. Something that transformed this girl from a victim into a strategic asset. Kessie's gaze found his across the crowded room, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes locked. In that brief connection, Rashid saw something that made his chest tighten, a flicker of recognition. Impossible as it seemed, she couldn't know him, and yet something in her expression suggested otherwise. The bidding began at a staggering $500,000, immediately eliminating all but the most serious players. Voices called out from different corners of the room, each increase accompanied by the rustle of expensive fabric and the clink of gold jewelry. Rashid watched in fascination and horror as the price climbed higher, wondering what kind of knowledge could make a human being worth such an astronomical sum. At $800,000, only 3 bidders remained active. An elderly man with a Turkish accent raised his paddle with the mechanical precision of someone accustomed to acquiring whatever he desired. A woman in a burgundy hijab whispered her bids to a younger man beside her, her strategy clearly more calculated than emotional. And then there was the third bidder, a figure Rashid couldn't quite make out in the shadows, near the back of the room. As the price approached $1 million, Rashid found himself studying Kessie more intently. There was something about her posture, the way she held her chin high despite her circumstances, that reminded him of someone. The memory danced at the edge of his consciousness, frustratingly elusive yet undeniably present. $1 million, called the Turkish man, his voice cutting through the tension like a sword. The room fell silent. It was an unprecedented amount for such an auction, high enough to give even the wealthiest attendees pause. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with avarice as he prepared to call the sale final. But then Kessie did something that changed everything. She spoke. "You think you're buying me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room despite speaking barely above a conversational level. "But you have no idea what you're really purchasing." The auctioneer moved to silence her, but she continued, her gaze now fixed directly on Rashid. "Some of you are here because you were invited, others because you choose to be, but one of you is here because you have to be. Because 23 years ago, a promise was made, and tonight, that promise comes due." Rashid's blood ran cold. 23 years ago, the timeline hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair as fragments of the past began reassembling themselves in his mind. 23 years ago, he'd been a different man, younger, more idealistic, working as a junior executive for his father's import-export business. It was during that time that he'd traveled to Ghana on what was supposed to be a routine business trip, a journey that had changed the course of his entire life. The girl on the platform continued speaking, her words aimed like arrows at targets only she could see. "There's a photograph in the breast pocket of a midnight blue suit somewhere in this room. A photograph of a woman named Abina and her newborn daughter. A photograph that was supposed to ensure a promise would never be forgotten." Rashid's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, where indeed a small photograph rested, one he'd carried for over 2 decades, like a talisman of guilt and responsibility. The photograph showed a young Ghanaian woman holding an infant, both of them smiling despite the poverty evident in their surroundings. On the back, written in his own handwriting, were the words, "To Kessie, may you never want for anything, R.A.Z." The room erupted into confused murmurs as the other bidders tried to understand what was happening. But Rashid could only stare at the girl on the platform, his mind reeling as impossible pieces began falling into place. "My name is Kessie Abina Ose," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And the man I've been looking for my entire life is sitting in this room right now. The man who made a promise to my dying mother, the man who disappeared. Before he could keep that promise, Rashid rose from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. The photograph in his pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around him, the other bidders watched in confusion as the auction transformed into something none of them had anticipated. "Kessie," he whispered, the name carrying with it the weight of 23 years of guilt and regret. She nodded, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Hello, Papa. I've been looking for you for a very long time." The auction house fell into stunned silence as the true nature of the evening's final revelation began to dawn on everyone present. This wasn't just another transaction in the shadowy world of human trafficking. This was a daughter's desperate gambit to find the father who had vanished from her life before she was old enough to remember his face. And Rashid Al-Zahrani, one of the most powerful men in North Africa, realized that the most important deal of his life was about to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence in the underground auction house stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Rashid stood frozen, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume he'd been wearing for 23 years. A disguise that had just been stripped away by 3 simple words: "Hello, Papa." The other bidders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they had become unwitting witnesses to something far more complex than a simple human auction. The Turkish man who had bid $1 million lowered his paddle slowly, his calculating eyes darting between Rashid and the girl on the platform. The woman in the burgundy hijab whispered urgently to her companion, clearly trying to assess whether this unexpected development presented an opportunity or a threat. But Rashid could see none of them. His world had narrowed to the young woman, standing defiantly on the auction block, her eyes Abina's eyes boring into his soul with an intensity that made his chest tight. The photograph in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric, a physical reminder of the promise he'd made and the life he'd abandoned. "This is touching," the auctioneer said, his gold teeth glinting as he tried to regain control of his carefully orchestrated evening. "But we have a business to conclude. The bid stands at $1 million, $2 million. Rashid's voice cut through the man's words like a blade through silk. The amount was spoken quietly, but in the hushed room, it carried the weight of thunder. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. $2 million was beyond extravagant. It was a declaration of war against anyone who might dare to challenge him for ownership of this moment, this girl, this chance at redemption that had materialized from the darkness of his past. The Turkish man's eyes widened in disbelief. The woman in the hijab shook her head and gathered her purse, clearly recognizing when she was outclassed. Even the mysterious figure in the shadows made no move to counter such an astronomical bid. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, though his voice carried a note of confusion rather than triumph. "Tumor, Al-Zahrani," Rashid said, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring within him. "Rashid Al-Zahrani." As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the unprecedented turn of events, Rashid found himself walking toward the platform with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Each step carried him closer to a reckoning he'd been avoiding for over 2 decades. Kessie remained perfectly still as he approached, her earlier defiance now tempered by something that looked almost like relief. When he was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, another trait inherited from her mother, she spoke again, her voice soft but unwavering. "You remember her, don't you? My mother?" Rashid's throat felt like sandpaper. "Abina." Her name was Abina Osei. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of guilt and longing. "She never stopped talking about you," Kessie continued, stepping down from the platform to stand before him. Despite her small stature, she seemed to fill the space between them with a presence that was both accusatory and forgiving. Even when she was dying, even when the fever made her delirious, she would whisper your name and tell me that someday my father would come back for us. The words hit Rashid like physical blows. He had expected anger, perhaps hatred for his abandonment, but this quiet statement of faith, this revelation that Abina had spent her final moments believing in a promise he'd been too cowardly to keep, was somehow worse than any accusation could have been. I looked for you, he said, the words tumbling. Out in a rush after I returned to Morocco, I tried to find you both. I sent money, letters, investigators to the wrong address. Cassie interrupted, not unkindly. We moved 3 months after you left. The village where you knew us, it no longer exists. Corporate mining destroyed it 5 years later. She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. But you didn't look very hard, did you? Not as hard as a man with your resources could have looked. It was true, and they both knew it. Rashid had looked, yes, but he'd also allowed himself to be discouraged by the first few dead ends. He'd been young, overwhelmed by the implications of fatherhood, and terrified of the scandal that an illegitimate African daughter might bring to his family's traditional values. So when his initial efforts failed, he'd convinced himself that perhaps it was for the best that Abina and the child would be better off without the complications his presence would bring to their lives. You're right, he admitted, the confession, feeling like swallowing glass. I was a coward. I was 25 years old, scared of my father's reaction, scared of what acknowledging you would mean for my future. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. Cassie nodded, as if his honesty was exactly what she'd been waiting to hear. She forgave you, you know. Even at the end, when she had every reason to hate you, she told me that you were a good man who had made a scared boy's decision. She said that someday I would find you, and when I did, I should give you the chance to make a man's choice instead. The auction house had emptied around them, leaving only the two of them standing in the sudden stillness. Somewhere in the distance, Rashid could hear the sounds of Marrakech's nightlife, filtering down through the hotel above laughter, music, the normal sounds of people living normal lives, unaware that destinies were being rewritten in the basement below. How did you end up here? Rashid asked, gesturing toward the platform where she'd been displayed like merchandise. How did you go from looking for me to being sold at an auction? Cassie's expression hardened slightly, the first hint of the steel that had kept her alive through what must have been an extraordinary journey. After my mother died, I was taken in by missionaries. They educated me, taught me English, Arabic, French, but they also told me everything they knew about you, your family, your business, your wealth. When I turned 18, I left Ghana with a single purpose, to find Rashid al-Zahrani and fulfill my mother's dying wish. She began walking toward the exit, and Rashid fell into step beside her, eager to hear the rest of her story. I spent 2 years working my way north, she continued. Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. I learned how to navigate the black markets, how to trade information for safe passage, how to survive in places where a young African woman is seen as prey rather than a person. And everywhere I went, I heard whispers about the powerful businessman who could make problems disappear with a phone call. They reached the stairs leading up to the hotel lobby, but neither of them moved to climb them. This conversation felt too important to be interrupted by the transition back to the normal world. 3 months ago, I finally tracked you to Casablanca, Cassie said, but your security was too tight. I couldn't get close enough to approach you directly. So I started watching, learning your patterns, trying to find a weakness in your armor. And you found one, Rashid said, beginning to understand the elaborate plan that had brought them to this moment. Your guild, she confirmed. I learned about your charitable work in Africa, your anonymous donations to orphanages and schools. But I also learned about your collection. Rashid frowned. My collection. Photographs. Cassie said simply, you collect photographs of the places you've been, the people you've met. Your staff talks, Mr. al-Zahrani. They know about the special room in your house where you keep mementos from your travels. And they know about the one photograph you carry with you. Everywhere a picture of a woman and her baby, the pieces of her plan began falling into place in Rashid's mind, each revelation more impressive than the last. You knew I would come here tonight. I arranged for you to come here tonight, she corrected. The invitation was my idea. I told the people who acquired me that there was a wealthy businessman in Casablanca who had a connection to my family. I suggested that if they could get him to the auction, he might be willing to pay an extraordinary amount to ensure my safety. Rashid stared at her in amazement. You orchestrated your own kidnapping. I offered myself. She clarified, "These people deal in information as much as they deal in human lives. I told them that if they could guarantee you would be at the auction, I would surrender myself willingly. No fighting, no escape attempts, no complications. Just a clean transaction that would make them wealthy and give me the chance I'd been searching for." The audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She had essentially gambled her life on the hope that his guilt and conscience would compel him to save her, trusting that the father who had abandoned her as an infant would prove to be the man her mother had believed him to be. "And if I hadn't bet on you?" Rashid asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Then I would have found another way," Kessie said with quiet confidence. "This was just the most direct path. I've spent 3 years learning everything about you, Mr. Al-Zarani. I knew you wouldn't be able to sit in that room and watch someone you recognized as your daughter be sold to the highest bidder." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. Rashid found himself marveling at the young woman before him, her intelligence, her determination, her willingness to risk everything for the chance at a relationship with a father she'd never really known. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Kessie looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd revealed her identity, her composure cracked slightly. Beneath the confidence and careful planning, he could see the frightened young woman who had lost everything and everyone she'd ever cared about, who had built her entire adult life around the hope of finding the one person who might care about her in return. "Now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you have the chance to keep the promise you made to my mother. The question is, will you?" Rashid reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the worn photograph he'd carried for 23 years. The edges were soft with handling, and the colors had faded slightly, but the image was still clear. Abina holding her newborn daughter, both of them smiling at the camera, with expressions of pure joy and hope. He held it out to Kessie, watching as her eyes filled with tears at the sight of her mother's face. "I've been waiting 23 years to give this back to where it belongs," he said softly, "and to finally become the father I should have been from the beginning." As Kessie took the photograph with trembling hands, Rashid realized that the most important transaction of his life had nothing to do with the $2 million he'd just spent. It was about the priceless opportunity to finally make things right, to honor the promise he'd made to a dying woman, and to discover what it truly meant to be a father to the remarkable young woman who had risked everything to find him. The elevator to the hotel lobby seemed to take an eternity, though it was probably no more than 30 seconds. Rashid stood beside Kessie in the gilded compartment, acutely aware that their lives had just taken a dramatic turn, but uncertain what the next chapter would hold. The photograph now rested in Kessie's hands, and she studied it with the intensity of someone seeing their mother's face for the first time in years. "She was beautiful," Rashid said softly, breaking the silence as the elevator climbed toward the surface world. "She was everything," Kessie replied, her thumb tracing the edge of the photograph. "Mother, father, teacher, protector. She worked 3 jobs to keep us fed and still found time to teach me mathematics by candlelight." She looked up at him, her expression searching. "Tell me about when you knew her. Tell me about the man who made her believe in promises." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the opulent lobby of the Crescent Moon Hotel. Crystal fountains bubbled softly beside towering arrangements of white roses, and well-dressed guests moved through the space with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to luxury. It was a world away from the underground chamber they'd just left. Yet Rashid felt more exposed here than he had in the auction house. "Not here," he said, glancing around at the other guests. "There are too many eyes, too many ears. We need somewhere private." Kessie nodded, understanding immediately. Her years of survival had taught her to recognize when discretion was necessary. "Your hotel room. I have a suite on the top floor," Rashid confirmed, leading her toward a private elevator that required a key card to access. "We can talk freely." There, as they rode up to the 21st floor, Rashid found himself studying Kessie's reflection in the polished elevator doors. The resemblance to Abina was unmistakable. The same graceful neck, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking deeply about something. But there were differences too, qualities that were uniquely hers. a steel in her spine that spoke of battles fought and won, a wariness in her gaze that came from years of looking over her shoulder. The suite was everything one would expect, from Morocco's most exclusive hotel, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Marrakech's ancient Medina, furniture that blended traditional Moroccan craftsmanship with modern luxury, and a terrace that overlooked the snow-capped Atlas Mountains in the distance. But as impressive as the accommodations were, they seemed insignificant compared to the conversation about to unfold. Kessie moved to the windows, her silhouette framed against the twinkling lights of the city below. "It's beautiful," she said, though her tone suggested her mind was elsewhere. 23 years ago. "Your mother said the same thing about a much smaller view," Rashid replied, settling into one of the suite's leather armchairs. She was standing at the window of a modest hotel room in Accra, looking out at a marketplace. "She told me that she could see the whole world in the faces of the people buying and selling below." Kessie turned from the window, her attention fully focused on him now. "You stayed in the same hotel?" Rashid nodded, the memories flooding back with startling clarity. "The Golden Tulip. I was there for 2 weeks, negotiating a contract for my father's company. We were importing textiles, traditional kente cloth, mostly. It was my first international assignment, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of the family business." He paused, remembering how young and ambitious he'd been, how certain that success in business was the only measure of a man's worth, how naive he'd been about the complexities of life beyond the sheltered world of his privileged upbringing. "Your mother worked at the hotel," he continued. "Not as an employee. She couldn't afford the uniforms or the credentials required for that. She sold flowers outside the entrance every morning, beautiful arrangements that she made herself from whatever blooms she could find or afford. White jasmine, red hibiscus, sometimes just simple wildflowers arranged with an artist's eye." Kessie moved closer, settling into the chair across from him. "She never told me you met at the hotel. She always said you found each other in the marketplace." "In a way, we did." Rashid smiled at the memory. "I bought flowers from her every morning for a week, but I was too nervous to do more than exchange a few polite words. She must have thought I was either incredibly shy or incredibly arrogant, this well-dressed young man who would buy her most expensive arrangements but barely speak to her." "So what changed?" Kessie asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "A thunderstorm," Rashid said. "One of those sudden, violent storms that appear out of nowhere in West Africa. I was coming back from a business dinner when the rain started, and I saw her huddled under the hotel's awning, protecting her unsold flowers from the downpour. She was soaked through, shivering, but still arranging and rearranging those flowers to keep them perfect." He could see the scene as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Abina's determination to protect her livelihood even in the face of nature's fury. The way her wet dress clung to her slight frame, the fierce concentration on her face as she worked. "I offered to buy all her remaining flowers," Rashid continued, "not because I needed them, but because I couldn't stand watching her suffer for the sake of a few more sales." She looked at me like I was crazy and asked what one man could possibly do with 50 flower arrangements. "What did you tell her?" Kessie asked, her eyes bright with interest. "The truth, that I didn't need the flowers, but I needed an excuse to talk to her." Rashid felt his cheeks warm slightly at the admission. She laughed, then this beautiful, musical sound that I can still hear perfectly 23 years later. "And she said that if I wanted to talk to her, I should simply ask her to have tea with me instead of buying her entire inventory." Kessie smiled for the first time since they'd left the auction house, and Rashid felt his heart clench at how much she looked like her mother in that moment. "So you had tea together," she prompted. "Every afternoon for the remaining week of my stay," Rashid confirmed. "She would finish selling her flowers, and I would finish my business meetings, and we would meet at a small cafe in the Medina. She told me about her dreams of opening her own flower shop, about the village where she'd grown up, about her plans to save enough money to attend university. And I told her about Morocco, about my family's business, about the world beyond Ghana's borders." The memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the knowledge of how the story would unfold. But they were also precious, the foundation of something real and meaningful. that had somehow produced the remarkable young woman sitting across from him. On my last night in Accra, I asked her to have dinner with me, Rashid continued, his voice growing softer, not at the cafe, but at the hotel restaurant. She said she didn't have the right clothes for such a place, so I may have convinced the hotel's boutique to accidentally leave a beautiful dress in her size outside her room, along with a note saying it was a gift from an anonymous admirer. Cassie laughed, a sound so similar to her mother's that it sent shivers down Rashid's spine. She kept that dress, you know. It was the nicest thing she ever owned. Even when we had nothing else, even when we were living in a single room with 3 other families, she kept that dress wrapped in paper at the bottom of our one suitcase. The revelation hit Rashid like a physical blow. He'd assumed that Abina had forgotten him as quickly as he'd tried to forget her, that their brief romance had been nothing more than a pleasant interlude for both of them. To learn that she'd treasured a memento of their time together, that she'd carried it with her through years of hardship and struggle, was almost too much to bear. That night at dinner, he managed to continue, was the most magical evening of my life. We talked about everything: philosophy, literature, dreams for the future. She was so intelligent, so wise beyond her years. She made me see the world differently, made me question assumptions I'd never even realized I was making. And then, Cassie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. And then I made the biggest mistake of my life, Rashid said heavily. I left the next morning without saying goodbye. My flight was early, and I convinced myself that it would be easier for both of us if I just disappeared. No promises that might be broken, no commitments that might complicate our lives. I thought I was being noble, sparing us both the pain of a long goodbye. But she was pregnant, Cassie said quietly. She was pregnant, Rashid confirmed, and I didn't know. By the time she realized it herself, I was already back in Casablanca, throwing myself into work and trying to convince myself that what we'd shared had been nothing more than a vacation romance. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Rashid stared out at the lights of Marrakesh, wondering how different all their lives might have been if he'd been brave enough to stay, or at least brave enough to maintain contact. She tried to reach you, Cassie said eventually, after I was born. She wrote letters to your father's company, but they were returned unopened. My father's doing, Rashid said bitterly. He must have recognized her name when I finally told him about you both years later. He would have seen any communication from her as a threat to the family's reputation. So you did tell him, eventually, when the guilt became too much to bear, when I realized what a coward I'd been. But by then, as you said, you'd moved. The addresses I had were no longer valid. My father hired investigators, but their searches led nowhere. After a while, I began to wonder if you'd both died, if my cowardice had cost me the chance to ever make things right. Cassie stood and walked back to the window, the photograph still clutched in her hands. She never stopped believing you would come back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Even when she got sick, even when the medicine was too expensive, and the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, she would hold this photograph and tell me stories about my father who lived in a palace by the sea, and who would someday come to take us home. The image of Abina dying alone, comforting herself and her daughter with fantasies about a man who had abandoned them, was almost unbearable. Rashid felt tears burning behind his eyes, the first tears he'd shed in decades. I failed her, he said simply. I failed you both. Yes, Cassie agreed, turning back to face him. You did. But she also taught me that failure isn't the end of the story unless you choose to make it so. The question now is, what are you going to do with the second chance you've been given? Before Rashid could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his head of security, a man who only contacted him for genuine emergencies. Excuse me, he said to Cassie, answering the call. Hassan, what is it? Sir, we have a problem. There are men watching your hotel, professional surveillance, and they're not trying very hard to hide it. Something about tonight's activities has attracted unwanted attention. Rashid's blood ran cold. He'd been so focused on his reunion with Cassie that he'd forgotten about the dangerous world. They'd just escaped from a world that wouldn't simply let a $2 million transaction disappear. Without consequences. How many? He asked, moving to the window and peering down at the street below. At least 6 that we've identified. Possibly more. Sir, I think you need to leave the hotel immediately. Rashid looked at Kessie, who had clearly understood enough of the conversation to realize they were in danger. Her expression had shifted from emotional vulnerability back to the hardened wariness of someone who had spent years running from threats. It's not over, she said, though whether she was referring to their conversation or their danger, he couldn't tell. No, Rashid agreed, ending the call and moving toward the suite's safe to retrieve his emergency cash and documents. It's just beginning. The emergency stairwell of the Crescent Moon Hotel was a stark contrast to the opulent corridors above. Bare concrete walls echoed with their hurried footsteps as Rashid led Kessie down 21 flights, his hand firmly gripping a leather briefcase containing cash, documents, and a 9mm pistol he'd hoped never to use outside a shooting range. Tell me about these people who arranged the auction, Rashid said quietly as they descended, his voice barely carrying over the sound of their movement. How deep does their organization run? Kessie's breathing was controlled despite their rapid pace. Clearly, her years of survival had kept her in excellent physical condition. Deeper than you can imagine, she replied. They call themselves the Maghreb Collective. They operate across North Africa and the Middle East, trafficking in people, information, and influence. What makes them dangerous isn't just their reach, it's their patience. They paused at the 15th floor landing as Rashid's phone buzzed with a text from Hassan. Lobby compromised. Service entrance clear for now. Black sedan waiting in alley behind kitchen. Patience, Rashid asked as they continued their descent. They play long games, Kessie explained. Sometimes they'll spend years setting up a single operation. The auction tonight wasn't just about selling people. It was about gathering intelligence on everyone who attended. They now know exactly how much you're willing to pay for something you value, and they've seen you act emotionally rather than strategically. The implication hit Rashid like a cold wind. By bidding $1 million for Kessie, he'd essentially painted a target on both their backs. He'd shown weakness, desperation, and most importantly, he'd revealed that she mattered to him more than money. You knew this would happen, he said, though it wasn't really a question. I hoped it wouldn't, Kessie corrected, but I planned for the possibility. These people don't like loose ends, and you just made us both very loose ends indeed. They reached the ground floor, and Rashid carefully cracked open the stairwell door to peer into the service corridor. The area was dimly lit and empty except for a few housekeeping carts. In the distance, he could hear the normal sounds of a luxury hotel after midnight, the quiet hum of elevators, the soft chatter of late-night room service deliveries, the occasional laugh from the bar. How do you know so much about the collective? Rashid asked as they moved carefully down the corridor toward the kitchen entrance. Because I've been hunting them for 3 years, Kessie said, her voice carrying a hardness that made Rashid look at her sharply. Finding you was only part of my mission. The other part was gathering intelligence on the organization that destroyed my village and killed my mother. Rashid stopped walking. Kessie, what are you talking about? You said your mother died of illness. She did, Kessie replied, her eyes never leaving the corridor ahead. But the illness came from contaminated water wells, and the wells were contaminated because the collective's mining operations dumped chemical waste into the groundwater. My mother, along with 63 other people in our village, died slowly and painfully because these people valued profit over human life. The revelation reframed everything. Kessie hadn't just been looking for her father, she'd been on a mission of vengeance. The auction, her surrender to traffickers, even her search for Rashid, it was all part of a larger plan to bring down the organization responsible for her mother's death. The information you mentioned having, Rashid said, understanding beginning to dawn. It's not about me, is it? Some of it is, Kessie admitted, but most of it is evidence of the collective's operations across 6 countries. Financial records, shipping manifests, correspondence between corrupt officials. 3 years' worth of careful documentation that could destroy them if it reached the right people. They reached the kitchen service door, and Rashid could see Hassan's black sedan idling in the narrow alley beyond. But as he reached for the door handle, Cassie grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Something's wrong." Rashid peered through the door's small window and saw what had alarmed her. Hassan stood beside the car, but his posture was too rigid, his hands positioned in a way that suggested he was being held at gunpoint by someone outside Rashid's line of sight. "They're faster than I expected," Cassie murmured. "How many people knew about your security arrangements?" "Only Hassan and 2 others. Rashid replied, his mind racing. "But the collective clearly has resources I underestimated." "No," Cassie said, her voice taking on an urgent edge. "You're still thinking like a businessman. The collective doesn't just have resources, they have inside information. Someone in your organization has been feeding them intelligence." The possibility hit Rashid like a physical blow. His security team, his staff, even his closest advisors, any one of them could have been compromised. The careful walls of protection he'd built around his life had been breached from within. "We need another exit," he said, backing away from the door. "There isn't one," Cassie replied. "I studied the building plans before tonight. This is the only service entrance, and the main lobby is compromised. We're trapped." Rashid felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had served him well in hostile business negotiations. But this was far beyond anything he'd encountered in the corporate world. He was facing enemies who played by no rules, who would kill without hesitation if it served their purposes. "Then we make our own exit," he said. Surprised by the steadiness in his own voice, Cassie looked at him with something approaching respect. "What do you have in mind?" Rashid pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. "I have a friend who owes me a considerable favor. Someone with access to resources that even the collective would find difficult to match." The call was answered on the second ring. "Rashid, do you know what time it is?" "Colonel Benali, I need an extraction. To people, Marrakesh, immediate danger." There was a pause, and when the voice returned, it carried the crisp authority of a military commander. "Are you compromised?" "Yes. Professional surveillance, possibly armed. I'm at the Crescent Moon Hotel with a civilian who possesses intelligence valuable to national security." Another pause. "Intelligence regarding what?" Rashid looked at Cassie, who nodded her permission. "Human trafficking networks operating across the Maghreb. Financial crimes, corruption, chemical dumping, enough to take down a major criminal organization." "Understood. Stay where you are. We'll have a team on the roof in 15 minutes. As Rashid ended the call, Cassie stared at him with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. "Colonel Benali, as in Colonel Youssef Benali, head of Morocco's special forces?" "You know him. Every intelligence operative in North Africa knows him," Cassie said. "He's incorruptible, which makes him dangerous to people like the collective. But it also makes him an enemy they've been trying to eliminate for years." "How do you know about intelligence operatives?" Rashid asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because I am one," Cassie said simply. "Or was. I worked for Ghana's National Intelligence Bureau before I went freelance to hunt the collective. My mission to find you was sanctioned at the highest levels of the Ghanaian government." The revelations kept coming, each one reshaping Rashid's understanding of the woman before him. She wasn't just his daughter, she was a trained operative, a spy who had orchestrated an incredibly complex operation to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. "So finding me, gathering intelligence on the collective, allowing yourself to be auctioned, it was all part of an official mission." "Officially, I'm pursuing evidence of transnational crimes that have affected Ghanaian citizens," Cassie said. "Unofficially, I'm a daughter looking for her father." The two missions happened to converge at the same point. They made their way back through the service corridor toward a stairwell that would take them to the roof. Behind them, Rashid could hear the faint sounds of commotion, voices calling softly, footsteps in the kitchen. The systematic search that would eventually lead their pursuers to this corridor. 15 minutes is a long time when people are hunting you, Cassie observed as they climbed. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't find us for 15 minutes, Rashid replied. As they reached the 10th floor, Cassie suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" Rashid listened carefully and caught the sound of multiple sets of footsteps in the stairwell below them, at least for people, moving with the coordinated precision of a trained team. "They're in the building," he said, "and they're between us And the roof, Kessie added. They were trapped in the middle of a 21-story building, with enemies below and their rescue still 14 minutes away. But as Rashid looked at his daughter, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to find him and expose the criminals who had destroyed her world, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. He felt ready to fight. "Kessie," he said, pulling the pistol from his briefcase and checking the magazine, "I need you to know that whatever happens in the next few minutes, I'm proud of you. Your mother raised an extraordinary woman." Kessie smiled, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the child she might have been if he'd stayed to raise her. "Save the sentiment for later, Papa. Right now, we have work to do." She reached into her dress and pulled out a small but deadly-looking knife, its blade glinting in the stairwell's fluorescent lighting. "I learned a lot more than flower arranging while I was growing up." As the footsteps below grew closer and the sounds of their pursuers echoed through the concrete shaft, father and daughter prepared to face their enemies together. The next 14 minutes would determine whether their reunion would be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives or the final scene in both their stories. But for the first time since leaving Ghana 23 years ago, Rashid Al-Zahrani felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The 10th floor of the Crescent Moon Hotel felt like a war zone waiting to happen. Rashid and Kessie pressed themselves against the concrete wall of the stairwell, listening to the methodical approach of their pursuers from below. The footsteps were disciplined, professional, not the chaotic scrambling of desperate criminals, but the measured advance of military-trained operatives. "For men, possibly 5, Kessie whispered, her ear pressed to the wall. "They're checking each floor as they climb. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach us." Rashid's mind raced through their options. Above them lay 11 more floors, and the roof where salvation waited in the form of Colonel Benali's extraction team. Below them lay certain death or capture by an organization that had already demonstrated its ruthlessness. The mathematics were simple. They had to go up, and they had to go fast. "Can we reach the roof before they catch us?" he asked. Kessie shook her head. "Not at the pace they're maintaining. They're gaining ground with every floor." "Then we change the rules of engagement," Rashid said, surprising himself with the coldness in his voice. 23 years of boardroom battles had taught him that sometimes the only way to win was to do something your opponent didn't expect. He opened the stairwell door to the 10th floor hallway, revealing a long corridor lined with elegant guest room doors. The plush carpeting would muffle their footsteps, and the multiple branching paths offered tactical advantages that the narrow stairwell didn't provide. "We're not running anymore," he said. "We're hunting." Kessie's eyes lit up with approval. "Now you're thinking like an operative. What do you have in mind?" "These men are professionals, which means they follow protocols," Rashid explained as they moved silently down the hallway. "They'll clear each floor systematically, room by room if necessary. But they're expecting prey that runs, not prey that fights back." Asterisk. They reached the hotel's housekeeping supply closet, and Rashid used his emergency master key card, a privilege that came with the penthouse suite, to open the door. Inside, they found exactly what he'd hoped for: industrial cleaning supplies, maintenance tools, and most importantly, the hotel's fire suppression system controls. "You're going to flood the building?" Kessie asked, watching him examine the fire system panel. "Better," Rashid said, his fingers working quickly across the controls. "I'm going to create chaos." The fire alarm system wasn't just about sprinklers. It controlled emergency lighting, elevator lockdowns, and automated announcement systems. With a few strategic overrides, Rashid could turn the hotel into a maze of confusion that would give them the advantage they needed. As he worked, Kessie positioned herself by the closet door, her knife ready and her body coiled like a spring. "Footsteps," she whispered. "They've reached this floor." Rashid finished his adjustments and stepped back from the panel. "In 30 seconds, every fire alarm in the building is going to activate. Emergency lighting will come on, regular lights will shut down, and the elevators will automatically return to the ground floor. Most importantly, every door in the hotel will unlock automatically as part of the evacuation protocol, giving us access to rooms we can use for cover," Kessie said, understanding immediately, "and giving their coordination a severe disadvantage." Rashid added, "Professional teams rely on communication and sight lines. Take those away, and even the best operatives become vulnerable." The countdown reached 0, and the hotel exploded into controlled chaos. Sirens wailed from every speaker, red emergency lights bathed the corridors in an eerie glow, and the recorded evacuation announcements began their urgent repetition in Arabic, French, and English. Throughout the building, Rashid could hear the sounds of confused guests opening their doors, voices calling out in alarm, and the general pandemonium that accompanied any large-scale emergency. "Now we move," Rashid said, opening the closet door. The hallway had been transformed. Emergency lighting cast long, dramatic shadows, and the sounds of the alarm system provided perfect cover for their movement. They could hear their pursuers calling out to each other in what sounded like Eastern European accents, professionals, but not locals, which meant their knowledge of the building's layout was limited to basic blueprints. Cassie led the way, moving with the fluid grace of someone trained in urban combat. She reached the corner of the hallway and held up her hand, signaling for Rashid to stop. Through the cacophony of alarms, they could hear voices coming from the direction of the main stairwell. "Two men heading for the elevators," she whispered. "They don't know the elevators are locked down. The other two are checking rooms on the east side, which gives us a clear path to the service stairs on the west side," Rashid concluded. They moved quickly but carefully, using the chaos of the fire alarm to mask their approach to the western stairwell. But as they reached the door, Cassie suddenly grabbed Rashid's arm and pulled him back against the wall. "Wait," she breathed. A figure emerged from the stairwell, not one of their pursuers, but someone Rashid recognized with a shock that hit him like a physical blow. "Malik," he whispered. Malik Bensouda, Rashid's personal assistant for the past 8 years, stepped into the hallway carrying a military-grade assault rifle. His familiar face was cold and professional, completely devoid of the loyalty and warmth Rashid had come to associate with the young man he'd mentored and trusted. "You look surprised, Mr. Al-Zahrani," Malik said, his voice carrying easily over the alarm system. "Though I suppose betrayal is always shocking when it comes from someone you consider family." Rashid felt his world tilt on its axis. Malik had been more than an employee. He'd been like a younger brother, someone Rashid had pulled from poverty and given opportunities, education, and trust. The idea that this betrayal had been years in the making was almost too much to process. "How long?" Rashid asked, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake occurring within him. "Since the beginning," Malik replied. "The collective recruited me before I ever applied for the position with your company. 8 years of building trust, gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to be useful. Tonight was that moment." Cassie stepped out from behind Rashid, her knife held low but ready. "Let me guess, you're the one who made sure the auction invitation reached him exactly when and how you wanted it delivered." Malik's eyes shifted to her, and his expression hardened further. "Miss Osei, or should I say, Agent Osei, your reputation precedes you. The collective has been very interested in your activities across North Africa." "I'm flattered," Cassie replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "though I have to say, I'm disappointed in their recruitment standards. Betraying a man who treated you like family, that's amateur psychology." "Family?" Malik laughed, but the sound held no humor. "He treated me like a useful pet, a charity case who should be grateful for scraps from his table. Do you know what it's like to spend 8 years watching someone live in luxury built on the suffering of others, pretending to care about justice while profiting from systems that crush people like me?" "So you joined an organization that traffics in human lives," Rashid said, his voice carrying a disappointment that seemed to affect Malik more than anger would have. "That's your idea of justice?" "I joined an organization that understands how the world really works," Malik shot back. "Power isn't about moral principles, it's about being willing to do what others won't. The collective doesn't pretend to be righteous, they simply are what they are." The philosophical debate might have continued, but Cassie had been listening to more than just Malik's words. The sound of approaching footsteps told her that the other pursuit team members were converging on their position. "Touching as this reunion is," she interrupted, "we have company incoming. 3 more operatives, maybe 4, closing from both directions." Malik smiled, raising his rifle. Actually, 6 more. And they're already here, as if summoned by his words. Figures emerged from doorways and corners throughout the hallway. The collective's team hadn't been randomly searching for them, they'd been herding them toward this exact spot, using the chaos of the fire alarm as cover for a carefully orchestrated trap. Rashid found himself back to back with Cassie in the center of the hallway, surrounded by armed professionals who had clearly been planning this moment for months. His pistol felt inadequate against their superior numbers and firepower, but he drew it anyway. "Papa," Cassie said softly, using the word for the first time since the auction house, "I need you to know that whatever happens next, finding you was worth it. My mother would have been proud. She would have been proud of you," Rashid corrected, checking his weapon. "And this isn't over yet." Above them, the sound of helicopter rotors began to echo through the building. Colonel Benali's extraction team had arrived, but they were still 11 floors away from salvation. "Gentlemen," Malik called out to his team, "our orders are to take them alive if possible. The collective has questions for both of them, and if it's not possible," one of the operatives asked. Malik's smile turned predatory. "Then we'll have to settle for just their intelligence files and evidence caches." As the circle of armed men began to close in, Rashid realized that the next few moments would determine not just their survival, but whether the organization that had destroyed Kessie's village and killed her mother would face justice, or continue operating with impunity. The fire alarm continued its urgent wailing. Red emergency lights painted everything in hellish colors, and somewhere in the distance, Salvation waited on a rooftop that might as well have been on another planet. But standing beside his daughter, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to find him and expose the truth, Rashid al-Zahrani felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a young man in love with a flower seller in Ghana. He felt ready to fight for something that mattered more than his own life. The standoff in the 10th floor hallway stretched like a taut wire, with 7 armed operatives forming a loose circle around Rashid and Cassie. The emergency lighting cast shifting shadows that made everyone appear ghost-like, while the relentless fire alarm created a soundtrack of urgency that matched the beating of Rashid's heart. But Cassie wasn't looking at the guns trained on them. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, tracking the sound of the helicopter rotors growing louder overhead. Her lips moved silently, counting seconds, calculating distances, measuring angles with the precision of someone who had spent years planning for exactly this kind of scenario. "Malik," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the alarm noise. With surprising calm, "you made one critical error in your planning." Malik's rifle remained trained on them, but his eyebrow raised slightly. "Really? And what would that be?" "You assumed I came here alone," Cassie replied, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You assumed that a Ghanaian intelligence operative would attempt a mission this complex without backup, without extraction protocols, without contingency plans." Rashid caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her weight moved to the balls of her feet. Whatever she was planning, it was about to happen fast. "Your helicopter friends," Malik scoffed. "They're 11 floors away and have no idea what's happening down here. Even if they breach the roof access, we'll be long gone with our prizes." "Not the helicopter," Cassie said, her smile widening. "Though I appreciate Colonel Benali's punctuality. I'm talking about the team that's been in position since before the auction began." As if summoned by her words, the building's lights suddenly cut out completely, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness except for the red emergency lighting. In that moment of confusion, Cassie moved. The knife left her hand with deadly precision, finding the throat of the operative closest to the stairwell door. Simultaneously, she tackled Rashid to the floor as suppressed gunfire erupted from both ends of the hallway. Shots that came not from the collective operatives, but from new players who had just entered the game. "Ghana National Intelligence sends its regards," a voice called out in accented English as tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a coordinated assault by a team that moved with military precision. Malik spun toward the new threat, his rifle spitting fire. But he was caught between two forces now. Cassie's backup team had infiltrated the building through routes that the collective hadn't anticipated. turning their carefully planned trap into a chaotic three-way battle. Rashid found himself pressed against the carpeted floor as bullets whined overhead. His world reduced to the sound of gunfire, shouting voices, and the steady presence of his daughter beside him. But even in the chaos, he could hear Cassie giving quiet orders into a throat microphone he hadn't noticed before. Team 2, secure the east stairwell. Team 3, elevator shaft breach in 30 seconds. Command, we have the package and are moving to extraction point Alpha. Package? Rashid asked as they crawled toward what appeared to be a safer position. Behind an overturned housekeeping cart. Cassie explained, ejecting the magazine from a pistol she'd acquired from somewhere and checking the rounds. Though, technically, we're both packages now. My mission parameters changed when I discovered you were my father. The gunfight raged around them with professional efficiency. Unlike the chaotic shootouts depicted in movies, this was precise, calculated violence between trained operatives who understood cover, angles, and ammunition conservation. But it was also brutally effective. Within 2 minutes, the hallway had been secured by Kessie's team, and the surviving collective operatives were either dead or retreating toward alternate escape routes. Malik wasn't among the casualties. In the confusion of the battle, Rashid's former assistant had managed to disappear. Though whether through death, capture, or escape wasn't immediately clear. Status report. Kessie called out as tactical lights illuminated the aftermath. 5. Targets neutralized. To escape via the service elevator. Came the reply from a woman who emerged from the shadows wearing full tactical gear. The helicopter team reports roof access secured. We have a clear path to extraction. But as they prepared to move toward the stairwell, an explosion rocked the building from below. The lights flickered, and through the broken windows, they could see flames beginning to lick at the lower floors. That would be the collective's scorched earth protocol. Kessie said grimly, if they can't have us, they'll make sure we don't leave with their secrets. How long before the building becomes unsafe? Rashid asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer, based on the explosion pattern. Maybe 10 minutes before structural integrity becomes compromised, the tactical team leader replied. But the fire will reach us much sooner than that. They began moving rapidly up the stairwell, but the sound of their boots on concrete was soon joined by another, more ominous sound: the roar of flames climbing through the building's infrastructure. The collective had turned the Crescent Moon Hotel into a death trap, gambling that they could eliminate their problems even if it meant destroying a landmark and killing hundreds of innocent guests. The evacuations, Rashid said suddenly, thinking of all the people who had been in their rooms when the fire alarm began. The other guests are being evacuated by emergency services. Cassie assured him, my team coordinated with local authorities before we ever entered the building. The fire department has been on standby, and evacuation buses are already removing people from the danger zone. As they climbed, Rashid found himself marveling at the complexity of the operation. His daughter had orchestrated. This wasn't just a rescue mission or even a simple intelligence-gathering exercise. It was a multi-layered plan that had anticipated everything from betrayal to building destruction to civilian casualties. How long have you been planning this? He asked as they reached the 15th floor. 3 years. Kessie replied without breaking stride. From the moment I learned that the collective was connected to my mother's death, I began building a case against them. But I needed someone with the resources and connections to make that case matter. I needed you. They paused at the 18th floor as one of the tactical team members reported structural damage. Below, the building was beginning to sway slightly, and the smell of smoke was growing stronger despite their height above the flames. The evidence you mentioned, Rashid said, it's not just intelligence files, is it? Financial records, shipping manifests, communication intercepts, witness testimonies, and most importantly, environmental impact studies that prove the collective knew their mining operations would contaminate local water supplies. Kessie confirmed. Enough to prosecute them in international court and freeze their assets across 6 countries. But only if we survive to deliver it. The team leader interjected. Sir, we need to move. The building's integrity is deteriorating faster than projected. They resumed their climb. But as they reached the 20th floor, The stairwell door burst open and Malik appeared, blood streaming from a head wound and desperation in his eyes. He held a detonator in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Nobody moves," he called out, his voice echoing in the concrete shaft. "This detonator is connected to charges throughout the building's support structure. One button, press, and this entire hotel comes down in 60 seconds. The tactical team had clear shots, but the risk of Malik reflexively triggering the detonator was too great. For a moment, everything stopped except the distant sound of flames and the beat of helicopter rotors on the roof above. "What do you want, Malik?" Rashid asked, stepping forward despite Kessie's attempt to restrain him. "Justice," Malik replied, though his hand trembled as he spoke. "You think you can expose the collective and walk away heroes? You have no idea what you're dealing with. These people have connections that reach into every government, every military, every intelligence service in the region. Your evidence will disappear, your witnesses will die, and nothing will change." "Maybe," Kessie said, also stepping forward. "But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have fought for something other than ourselves." "Fight for what?" Malik shouted. "For a world that doesn't care about people like us? For systems that grind up the poor and feed them to the rich? The collective isn't the disease, it's just a symptom of a world that values profit over people. Then help us change it," Rashid said quietly. "You say the evidence will disappear? Then help us make sure it doesn't. You say the witnesses will die? Then help us protect them. You were like a brother to me, Malik. That doesn't have to end here." For a moment, Malik's resolve seemed to waver. The young man who had worked beside Rashid for 8 years was still there, beneath the anger and betrayal and years of manipulation by the collective. But then the building shuddered as another explosion rocked its foundation, and the moment of possibility shattered like glass. "It's too late," Malik said, raising the detonator. For all of us, the tactical team prepared to fire. Kessie reached for a weapon, and Rashid stepped forward with his hand extended, still believing that somewhere in this young man was the brother he'd thought he knew. But as the detonator began to descend toward the trigger button, the sound of splintering concrete filled the stairwell, and everyone realized that the building's collapse had begun with or without Malik's explosives. They had seconds to reach the roof, and eternity to fall if they failed. The Crescent Moon Hotel groaned like a living thing in its death throes. 21 stories of concrete and steel shifted with a sound that resonated through every bone in Rashid's body as the structural supports gave way floor by floor. In the stairwell, gravity itself seemed to have become an enemy, pulling everything downward toward inevitable destruction. Malik's finger hovered over the detonator button, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who had run out of options. But the building's collapse had accelerated beyond his control. The collective's bombs had done their work too well, and now physics was writing the final chapter of their confrontation. "The detonator won't matter now," Kessie shouted over the sound of rending metal and cascading concrete. "We have maybe 90 seconds before the superstructure fails completely." As if to emphasize her point, a section of the stairwell wall cracked and began to buckle inward. Dust rained down from above, and through the gaps in the concrete, they could see the orange glow of flames climbing through the building's infrastructure. Like angry fingers reaching toward the sky, the tactical team leader made the decision for all of them: move everyone up. Now they abandoned any pretense of caution and ran, taking the stairs 3 at a time, despite the increasing instability of their footing. Behind them, Malik seemed frozen in place, staring at the useless detonator in his hand as his world collapsed around him literally and figuratively. But as Rashid reached the 21st floor landing, he stopped. Despite everything Malik had done, despite the betrayal and the years of deception, he couldn't leave the young man to die in the building's collapse. "Kessie, go," he called out as he turned back toward the stairwell. "Get to the roof." "Papa, no." Kessie grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce with determination. "We don't have time. We make time," Rashid said, pulling free from her grip. "He's still my responsibility." As the building shuddered again and pieces of the ceiling began to fall, Rashid descended the few steps back to where Malik stood, paralyzed by the magnitude of his failure. The young man looked up as Rashid approached, his face a mask of confusion and despair. "Why?" Malik asked, his voice barely audible over the sounds of destruction. "After everything I've done, why would you come back for me?" "Because you're not just a collective operative," Rashid said, extending his hand. "You're also the young man I taught to drive, who stayed up all night helping me prepare for the Al-Rashid merger, who sent flowers to your mother's grave every year on her birthday. That person is still in there, and he deserves a chance to make different choices." For a moment, Malik stared at the outstretched hand as if it were an alien artifact. Then, with a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, he dropped the detonator and grasped Rashid's wrist. They climbed together, Rashid supporting the younger man, who seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes. Above them they could hear Kessie and the tactical team shouting instructions to each other as they worked to secure the roof access. The helicopter's rotors were a constant thunder now, so close they could feel the vibrations through the building's failing structure. But as they reached the final landing, a massive section of the stairwell above them gave way, blocking their path with tons of concrete and twisted metal. They were trapped just one floor below salvation, with the building collapsing beneath them and no way to reach the roof. "There has to be another way," Rashid said, refusing to accept that they had come so far only to fail at the last moment. Kessie's voice came from above, muffled by the debris but still audible. "Papa, can you hear me?" "We're here," Rashid called back. "We're blocked, but we're alive." "Stand back from the debris," came the reply. "We're going to make our own door." The sound that followed was unlike anything Rashid had ever heard. A focused, controlled explosion that seemed to come from directly above them. When the dust cleared, a hole had been blown through the concrete barrier, and rope lines dropped down into their makeshift prison. "Shaped charges," Malik said with something approaching admiration. "Military grade. Your daughter doesn't mess around." Kessie rappelled down through the hole with the fluid grace of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Her tactical gear was scorched and dust-covered, but her eyes burned with determination as she assessed their situation. "The building has maybe 30 seconds left," she said, clipping safety harnesses to both men. "The helicopter can't land on the roof, too much structural damage. We're going up and out." The ascent was a nightmare of swinging ropes, falling debris, and the constant awareness that the building beneath them was in its final moments of existence. But Kessie's team had positioned themselves perfectly, hauling them up through the hole in the concrete and then immediately toward the roof access. They emerged onto the hotel's rooftop to find a scene of controlled chaos. Colonel Benali's military helicopter hovered 20 feet above the landing pad, unable to touch down because of the building's violent swaying. Rope ladders hung from the aircraft's side doors, and team members were already beginning their extraction. "Ladies first," the tactical team leader called out, gesturing for Kessie to go first. But Kessie shook her head, looking at Malik with an expression that might have been pity or professional assessment. "He goes first. If this building comes down with him on it, we lose our best source of intelligence about the collective's operations." Malik looked surprised. "You still think I'll cooperate? I think you'll make the right choice when given the opportunity," Kessie replied. "Besides, you've seen what happens to people who cross my father. He forgives them and offers them second chances. It's annoying, but effective." As Malik was hauled up into the helicopter, Rashid found himself standing beside his daughter on the swaying rooftop of a building that was seconds away from collapse. The city of Marrakesh spread out below them like a carpet of lights, beautiful and serene, unaware of the drama playing out high above its ancient streets. "Are you ready?" Kessie asked, gesturing toward the rope ladder. "Are you?" Rashid countered. "Once we leave this rooftop, once we deliver that evidence to the authorities, there's no going back. The collective will hunt us for the rest of our lives. You'll never be able to live normally, never be able to stop looking over your shoulder." Kessie smiled, and in that expression, Rashid saw both Abina's gentleness and a steel that was uniquely her own. "Papa, I stopped being normal the day my mother died from poisoned water. I stopped being safe the day I decided to hunt the people responsible. But now, for the first time in 3 years, I'm not alone in this fight." As if in response to her words, the building gave its final shudder and began its catastrophic descent toward the earth. There was no more time for conversation, no more moments for reflection. Rashid grasped the rope ladder and climbed, feeling the aircraft's powerful engines pulling them away from destruction and toward whatever future awaited them. But as they rose into the night sky above Marrakesh, as the Crescent Moon Hotel collapsed, in a cascade of fire and debris that lit up the darkness below, Rashid realized that something fundamental had changed in his life. The hollow pursuit of wealth and status that had defined his existence for 23 years had been replaced by something infinitely more valuable: purpose. Below them, emergency vehicles raced toward the destruction, their lights creating a constellation of hope against the darkness. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, but somehow comforting in their constancy. And beside him, his daughter, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to find him and expose the truth, watched the city recede beneath them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had kept a promise made to a dying mother. The helicopter banked toward the military airfield on the outskirts of the city, carrying with it not just 3 survivors of the Crescent Moon Hotel collapse, but the evidence that could bring down one of North Africa's most dangerous criminal organizations. But more importantly, it carried a father and daughter who had found each other against impossible odds, and who were now ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. The night was far from over, and their fight against the collective was just beginning. But as Rashid looked at Kessie's determined profile silhouetted against the helicopter's cabin lights, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in 23 years, that was enough. 6 months after the collapse of the Crescent Moon Hotel, the International Criminal Court in The Hague buzzed with an energy that only comes when decades of injustice are finally being brought to light. In the witness stand sat Malik Bensouda, no longer the conflicted young man torn between loyalty and betrayal, but someone who had found his path through the wreckage of his choices. Rashid sat in the gallery, watching as his former assistant methodically detailed the collective's operations across 6 countries. The evidence Kessie had spent 3 years gathering was now being presented piece by methodical piece, building an unassailable case against an organization that had considered itself untouchable. The mining operation in the Ashanti region was never about gold extraction, Malik testified, his voice steady as he addressed the international panel of judges. It was about lithium deposits that the collective needed for their electronics trafficking network. They knew the chemical processing would contaminate local water supplies, but the profit margins made the environmental damage an acceptable cost. In the front row of the gallery, Kessie took notes with the precision of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. She wore a simple black suit that gave her an air of professional authority, but Rashid could see the intensity in her eyes, the same fierce determination that had driven her from a village in Ghana to the witness stand of the world's most important court. The proceedings had taken months to arrange. The evidence Kessie had gathered was so extensive that it required teams of international prosecutors just to organize it into presentable cases. Financial crimes, human trafficking, environmental destruction, corruption of government officials. The collective's activities had tentacles reaching into every corner of legitimate society. But the case wasn't just about legal victories for Rashid. Watching the testimony unfold was a form of redemption that went far beyond personal salvation. Every piece of evidence presented was a vindication of Abina's faith in him, proof that the man she had believed him to be was finally emerging from the shadow of the coward who had abandoned her. During a recess, Rashid found himself walking with Kessie through the courthouse's marble corridors. The building itself seemed to embody the weight of justice, classical columns and soaring ceilings that spoke to humanity's highest aspiration, even as they dealt with its darkest realities. "How do you think she would feel about all this?" Rashid asked, though they both knew who he meant. "She would be proud," Kessie said without hesitation, "not just of the evidence or the prosecutions, but of what you've become. The man standing here today is the one she always believed you could be." It was true. Though the transformation hadn't been easy, in the months following their escape from Marrakesh, Rashid had liquidated significant portions of his business empire to fund the international legal effort. His wealth which had once been a shield separating him from the world's problems, had become a weapon for fighting them. Mr. Al-Zarani, a voice interrupted their conversation. They turned to see a young journalist, Sarah Chen from the International Herald Tribune, approaching with the eager energy of someone covering the story of their career. Ms. Chen, Rashid acknowledged. He'd grown accustomed to media attention over the past months, though he still found it surreal to be known for something other than business deals. I wanted to thank you both for agreeing to the interview yesterday, Sarah said, the human interest angle, the father searching for redemption, the daughter seeking justice. It's exactly the kind of story that helps people understand why these prosecutions matter. Kessie nodded politely, but Rashid could see the slight tension in her posture. Fame wasn't something either of them had sought, and the attention that came with being public figures in a high-profile case was still uncomfortable. Any word on when the verdict will be announced? Sarah asked. The judges indicated they need another week to review the financial evidence, Kessie replied. The paper trail is extensive, 3 years of documentation across multiple jurisdictions. What she didn't mention was that the waiting was the hardest part. After months of active investigation, testimony preparation, and legal proceedings, they were now in that liminal space where others would decide whether their efforts had been sufficient to bring the collective to justice. As they returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, Rashid noticed a familiar figure in the gallery, Colonel Benali, wearing civilian clothes, but unmistakably military in his bearing. The Moroccan officer had become an unexpected ally in their fight, using his connections to ensure that evidence reached the right prosecutors and that key witnesses remained safe during the legal process. The afternoon's testimony focused on the human trafficking operations, the auctions, the transportation networks, the corrupt officials who enabled the trade in human lives. It was difficult to listen to, but necessary. Each victim's story that emerged in the testimony was a reminder of why their fight mattered. But as the day's proceedings concluded, Rashid found himself thinking not about the grand scale of international justice, but about something much more personal. Tomorrow would mark exactly 1 year since Abina's death, an anniversary that Kessie had mentioned only once, and only in passing. That evening, they sat in Kessie's modest hotel room overlooking the Hague's peaceful canals. She had spread case files across the bed, reviewing testimony transcripts with the obsessive attention to detail that had made their legal case so formidable. But Rashid could see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the weight of carrying her mother's memory through every moment of this long journey toward justice. Kessie, he said gently, you don't have to work tonight. The case is in the judge's hands now. She looked up from the files, and for a moment, he saw not the professional intelligence operative or the determined prosecutor, but simply a young woman who had lost her mother and spent 3 years of her life seeking justice for that loss. I keep thinking I've missed something, she admitted. Some piece of evidence that could make the difference between conviction and acquittal. Some detail that could ensure they never hurt anyone else's family. Or Rashid moved to sit beside her on the bed, carefully gathering the scattered files into neat stacks. You've done everything humanly possible, more than anyone had a right to expect. Your mother would be amazed by what you've accomplished, would she? Kessie asked, her voice small. Sometimes I wonder if she would have wanted me to spend 3 years consumed by anger and revenge. Maybe she would have preferred that I just lived, found happiness, built a family of my own. It was the first time she had voiced these doubts, though Rashid suspected they had been growing throughout the long months of legal preparation. The cost of seeking justice had been enormous, not just financially, but emotionally and personally. Kessie had put her entire life on hold to build this case. She would have wanted you to have choices, Rashid said carefully, and you chose to fight for something bigger than yourself. That's not revenge, it's love. Love for her, love for the people the collective has hurt, love for future victims who will be spared because of what you've done. Kessie leaned against his shoulder, the first time she had allowed herself that kind of vulnerability since their reunion. What happens after the verdict? She asked. Win or lose, the case will be over. The evidence will be public record. The collective's operations have been exposed. What do we do then? It was a question Rashid had been pondering himself for months. Their lives had been defined by this single mission. When it ended, they would need to figure out how to be father and daughter without the urgent purpose that had brought them together. We learn how to be a family. He said simply, we visit your mother's grave together. We figure out what normal looks like for people like us. Maybe we start a foundation to help other families affected by environmental crimes. Maybe you go back to Ghana and use your intelligence training to help build something better. Maybe. I learned how to be the father I should have been 24 years ago. The next morning brought news that neither of them had expected. The judges had reached their verdict early, and the court would reconvene at noon for the announcement. As they walked through The Hague's cobblestone streets toward the courthouse, Rashid felt the weight of history in the making. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and representatives from the various countries affected by the collective's operations. But as the chief judge prepared to read the verdict, Rashid found his attention focused not on the legal proceedings, but on the worn photograph that Kessie carried in her jacket pocket, the same picture he had given her in the basement of a Moroccan hotel 6 months earlier. In the matter of the International Criminal Court versus the Maghreb Collective, the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. We find the defendants guilty on all charges of crimes against humanity, environmental destruction, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit genocide through environmental poisoning. The courtroom erupted in a controlled chaos of celebration, legal discussion, and journalistic activity. But Rashid heard it all as if from a great distance. What mattered was the sight of Kessie's hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her face as 24 years of injustice finally found its answer. Later, as they stood on the courthouse steps facing a crowd of reporters and cameras, Rashid thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A daughter's desperate gambit to find her father, a father's chance at redemption, a mother's faith in promises that seemed impossible to keep. Ms. Osei, one of the journalists, called out, "What would you say to other families who have been affected by environmental crimes?" Kessie stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the crowd. "I would say that justice is possible, but it requires courage. It requires people who are willing to fight for something bigger than themselves, and most importantly, it requires hope that the world can be better than it is. Hope that the promises we make to those we love can still be kept, even after they're gone." As the crowd dispersed and the media attention faded, Rashid and Kessie found themselves alone on the courthouse steps. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, and in the distance, they could hear the bells of The Hague's ancient churches marking the end of another day. "So," Kessie said, linking her arm through his, ready to learn how to be a normal family. Rashid smiled, looking at this remarkable woman who had changed his life by refusing to let him remain hidden from his past. "I think we're going to have to define normal for ourselves." As they walked away from the courthouse together, father and daughter united at last, the promise made to a dying woman in a small Ghanaian village was finally, truly, completely fulfilled. And in that fulfillment, both of them found something they had been searching for their entire lives. Home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.